April 1945. Berlin lies in ruins. The Soviets are closing in with devastating force. Beneath the city, deep within the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler prepares for his final days. Once the most feared man in the world, now imprisoned in an underground tomb. Paranoia, despair, and decay dominate the final hours of the Third Reich. The Führerbunker was not merely a shelter. It was the psychological grave of a crumbling dictatorship. Hidden beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, it was built to withstand Allied bombardments. By April 1945, it had transformed into a tomb. Concrete walls enclosing not just people, but delusions of power, wrapped in darkness and fear. Dimly lit, perpetually damp, and saturated with the smell of mold, it was claustrophobic and oppressive. Each step echoed through narrow corridors, interrupted by the distant rumble of Soviet artillery above. Officers and aides moved like shadows, haunted by fatigue and dread. Hope had long fled the bunker. What remained was a shared silence, an unspoken recognition that the end was near. Inside his modest suite, Adolf Hitler spent his final days. The grandeur of past rallies and conquests was reduced to isolated rants, paranoia, and physical decay. The once dominant Führer had become a shell, commanding ghosts from a grave he had built himself. Suicide became a quiet preparation. Cyanide capsules were handed out discreetly. Some clung to absurd hopes of secret weapons or reinforcements. But most understood the truth. Berlin would fall, and with it, the regime. The Führerbunker was more than a hiding place. It symbolized the final act of a twisted ideology, buried beneath a dying city, facing the unavoidable reckoning of its crimes. As the world above burned, the darkness below closed in. A dictator awaited death, and history held its breath. In the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler was barely recognizable as the man who had once held Europe in his grip. His physical deterioration was harrowing. Where he once radiated strength and discipline, now a weak, trembling figure shuffled through the halls of the Führerbunker. He stooped, his body bent, his movements slow and labored. The once imposing leader now resembled a terminal patient. One of the most visible signs of his decline was the uncontrollable tremor in his left hand. Witnesses noted how he often hid the hand behind his back, even during the rare public appearances in his final months. Doctors and historians have speculated that this tremor may have been caused by Parkinson's disease, though others suggest that his nervous system was severely damaged by years of amphetamine use prescribed by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes watery and dull. The fiery gaze that once captivated crowds was replaced by a vacant, defeated stare. His speech had become incoherent. He repeated himself, forgot words, and could barely articulate his thoughts. The Führer, once known for his rhetorical prowess, now spoke in mumbling sentences that echoed through the cold concrete walls of the bunker. His diet consisted of bland vegetarian meals, partly due to health issues and partly due to paranoia about being poisoned. He suffered from severe stomach problems and constant diarrhea. His teeth were in a dreadful state, rotted, blackened, painful. His breath reeked of decay, a stench even his closest aides struggled to ignore. Insomnia tormented him. What little sleep he got was often broken by nightmares of his downfall or disturbing visions from the front. His discomforts were made worse by the bizarre cocktail of medications administered by Morell. Injections of bull testosterone, opiates, and mixtures of unknown substances were meant to keep him alert and strong, but likely only hastened his decline. His skin turned ashen, his posture hunched, and he lost so much weight that his uniforms hung loosely from his frame. Yet Hitler refused to leave Berlin. Even as his body failed, his will clung to delusions of a final victory or martyrdom. He rejected outside medical help, preferring to let his body collapse within the lair of his self-fashioned myth. By the final days of April, Hitler was no longer the dictator who inspired terror in millions. He was a sick, old man, trapped in a concrete prison, living among the phantoms of a fallen empire. His physical decay was more than a personal tragedy. It was a reflection of the moral and ideological collapse of the Third Reich itself. The man who had destroyed so many lives ended up as a physical wreck, his strength gone, his voice silenced. Not on a battlefield, not in triumph, but as a fragile body that could no longer bear the madness of its own deeds. In the final weeks of April 1945, the Führerbunker was not just a physical prison. It reflected the psychological breakdown of Adolf Hitler. As Soviet shells crept ever closer, his world shrank to a small network of corridors, rooms, and an ever-diminishing circle of confidants. But even those close to him were not safe from his mounting paranoia. Everyone was a suspect. Hitler no longer trusted anyone. The man who had once relied implicitly on his inner circle, figures like Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, and even Joseph Goebbels, now accused them of betrayal or weakness. The smallest signs of hesitation or deviation from his orders were seen as proof of conspiracy. Conversations were held in whispers. Messages were no longer delivered in person, but through intermediaries. Fear ruled, not only above ground, but deep below it. This extreme distrust was not only rooted in military defeats, but also in real events. On April 23rd, Hitler learned that Göring had sent a message from Bavaria requesting permission to assume leadership, as stipulated by law if the Führer became incapacitated. Hitler saw this as a coup and declared Göring a traitor. Shortly after, news came that Himmler had sought contact with the Allies through a Swedish intermediary to negotiate a possible ceasefire. For Hitler, this was the ultimate betrayal. The loyalty that had sustained his power was exposed as an illusion. The bunker became a nest of suspicion and accusations. Hitler issued orders for the arrest or execution of his perceived traitors, although the means to carry them out often lacked. Soldiers who surrendered or fled were deemed cowards. Generals who suggested tactical retreats were labeled defeatists. His belief that Germany could still win was no longer fueled by reality, but by ideology and self-deception. Even subordinates who remained loyal, his secretaries or aides, barely dared to look him in the eye. Any comment could be misinterpreted. The atmosphere was suffocating. Some described a spiritual asphyxiation, more oppressive than the bombs falling overhead. Silence became a survival tactic. The Führer, once a master manipulator and orator, had become a man imprisoned by his own madness. He heard only what he wanted to hear. Reports from the front were edited to preserve his illusions. Generals no longer dared to offer honest advice. What remained was a parallel reality created deep within the bunker, where Hitler still believed victory was possible, if only everyone obeyed. This inner collapse marked not only Hitler's psychological end, but also the definitive breaking point of the Third Reich. The leader who had dragged millions into war and genocide was now only capable of mistrust, accusation, and retreating into the darkness he had forged for himself. In the dying days of the Third Reich, while Berlin burned and the world outside the bunker collapsed, Eva Braun made a fateful decision. She would stay with Adolf Hitler until the end. Her choice was not one of political ideology or strategic loyalty. It was, by all appearances, a deeply personal, almost tragic devotion. Eva Braun had been part of Hitler's life for over a decade, yet always in the shadows. Unlike the wives of other leaders, she held no official role, appeared rarely in public, and was deliberately hidden from view. She lived a secluded life in the background of history's most destructive regime. But in the final days, she stepped forward from the margins. When the opportunity arose to escape, Eva refused. She was urged by others, even by some within the bunker, to flee. She was still young, still had a life ahead of her. But her response was unwavering. "I belong to him," she reportedly said. "Where he is, there I want to be." On the night of April 28, 1945, as artillery shells shook the city above, Eva and Hitler were married in a brief, surreal ceremony inside the Führerbunker. The witnesses were a small group of staff and aides. Hitler wore a dark uniform, Eva a modest black dress. They signed the marriage registry with hands that trembled, his from disease and age, hers perhaps from fear or love. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. No celebration followed, only a meager toast with champagne and solemn faces. What might once have been a joyful union now resembled more a pact of mutual doom. For the newlyweds, there would be no honeymoon, no future, only a shared end. Over the next 24 hours, preparations for death continued. Eva remained calm, composed, even cheerful according to some accounts. She joked with others, reassured them, and behaved as if the world collapsing outside didn't matter. Perhaps she had resigned herself to fate long before. On April 30th, shortly after lunch, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to his private quarters. The door closed behind them. Moments later, a sharp sound, perhaps a single gunshot, echoed through the bunker. When aides entered, they found Hitler slumped on the couch with a pistol in hand. Beside him, Eva lay lifeless, her body intact, a cyanide capsule crushed between her teeth. Their bodies were quickly wrapped in blankets, carried up to the garden outside the chancellery, and set alight with gasoline, fulfilling Hitler's final wish, that nothing be left behind. Eva Braun's final choice, to die beside the most hated man in history, remains one of the most puzzling aspects of her life. Was it love? Was it delusion? Perhaps it was both. Her name, once unknown to the public, became immortal in those last shared hours, a symbol of unwavering devotion wrapped in the ultimate act of denial and despair. By late April 1945, the situation in Berlin had become irreversibly dire. The Red Army was closing in from all directions. The German military structure was in collapse, and civilian casualties mounted by the hour. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler's top generals gathered for what would be their final strategic meetings. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion and desperation. The once confident War Council had become a collection of nervous glances and hushed conversations. For years, Hitler had commanded with unchallenged authority, his word treated as prophecy. But now, even his most loyal military leaders saw the writing on the wall. They begged him to face reality. They proposed strategic retreats, surrender, even evacuation. The war was lost. They knew it, and they said so. Hitler refused. Denial clung to him like a second skin. He dismissed reports of Soviet advances as exaggerations, branded retreating generals as traitors, and fantasized about non-existent German counteroffensives. "The German people have failed me," he raged. "They are not worthy of me." His tirades grew more detached from reality with each passing day. As artillery thundered above, panic set in. Some officers deserted. Others began making secret arrangements to escape the city. Still, many remained, bound by oath or fear. The bunker was a fortress of delusion where Hitler continued to issue impossible orders to divisions that no longer existed. In that final War Council, the atmosphere was not one of strategy, but of impending doom. The Reich was collapsing, and no command could stop it. The Third Reich had reached its breaking point, and Hitler refused to let go. As his empire disintegrated around him, Adolf Hitler made one last, desperate attempt to shape his legacy. Trapped in the confines of the Führerbunker, with the Red Army just streets away, he dictated his political testament, a document meant to be his final message to the world. On April 29, 1945, in the early hours of the morning, Hitler summoned his remaining secretaries and close aides. He was gaunt and tremulous, but intensely focused. What emerged over the next few hours was not an apology, nor an admission of failure, but a defiant reaffirmation of his ideology. He blamed the Jews for the war, condemned his generals for betrayal, and framed himself as a misunderstood patriot who had fought for Germany's survival. The testament was split into two parts, a personal will and a political statement. In the personal section, Hitler outlined his desire to be cremated and ensured that none of his possessions would fall into the hands of the Soviet enemy. In the political segment, he named new leaders to succeed him, Admiral Karl Dönitz as president and Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. This move showed his intent to maintain the illusion of a functioning state, even as Berlin lay in ruins. Hitler's words were laced with bitterness. He spoke of betrayal, not just from his inner circle, but from the German people themselves. He declared that they had failed to live up to the greatness he had envisioned. Yet even in this final message, he clung to the myth of national redemption. The testament was typed and signed under siege conditions. Bullets and bombs rattled the city above, yet within the bunker, a man tried to script his place in history. It was a futile exercise. Within hours, both Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun, would be dead. The carefully crafted document would be recovered by Soviet forces, used as evidence of his delusion rather than validation of his ideals. In the end, the testament revealed not a leader coming to terms with his crimes, but one still lost in self-deception. It was not a confession. It was a continuation of propaganda, composed as the walls closed in. This final act of written legacy was Hitler's attempt to control the narrative. But history would write its own verdict, and it would be merciless. April 30th, 1945. The sun barely pierced the smoky skies above Berlin, but deep underground in the Führerbunker, it was just another morning, or so it seemed. The final day of Adolf Hitler's life began not with gunfire or panic, but with a strangely serene breakfast. The menu was simple: bread, jam, and a pot of weak tea. Hitler, who had been a vegetarian for much of his adult life, consumed only modest meals in his last years. That morning, he sat at the small table in his private quarters with Eva Braun beside him. The conversation, according to witnesses, was calm, even mundane. The couple spoke softly, avoiding any mention of the chaos above. Outside the bunker, Soviet artillery roared ever closer. Yet inside, the atmosphere was oddly still. It was as if those final moments had slipped beyond fear and entered a numb acceptance. Guards stood silently in the corridors, aides moved carefully, and everyone waited for what they knew was coming. What made this breakfast so chilling was the illusion of normalcy. Just hours before their deaths, Hitler and Eva clung to routine. No grand speeches, no final commands, just slices of bread and spoonfuls of jam. It was the calm before the fire. After the meal, Hitler bid farewell to his staff. He shook hands with his valet, his secretaries, his cook. He thanked them with surprising gentleness. Some wept. Others stood motionless, unsure how to respond. It was not the farewell of a leader, but the quiet departure of a man who had finally accepted the inevitable. In retrospect, the last breakfast was not just a meal. It was a ritual. Hitler's way of controlling the uncontrollable. By adhering to routine, he preserved the illusion of agency in a world collapsing around him. And then, calmly, he withdrew with Eva Braun into his room. The door closed behind them. Bread, jam, and poison. That was how the day began. The fire came soon after. April 30th, 1945. Just after 3:30 p.m., the silence in the Führerbunker was broken by a single gunshot. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were dead. Within minutes, Hitler's loyal aides carried out the final instructions he had left behind: destroy the bodies. The task fell to Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, and Martin Bormann, his private secretary. With the help of others, they wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them up a narrow staircase to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery. The courtyard, once a symbol of power, was now a battlefield cratered by shellfire and blanketed with debris. Soviet troops were only blocks away. There, in a shallow bomb crater near a half-destroyed concrete wall, the corpses were placed side by side. Hitler's final wish was clear. He did not want his remains to be paraded by the enemy, as Mussolini's had been. He wanted to vanish into ashes, leaving nothing behind but smoke and speculation. Gallons of gasoline were poured over the bodies. The fuel was hard to come by then, but a supply had been saved for this precise purpose. The men stepped back, struck a match, and set the corpses ablaze. Flames roared to life, consuming the last remnants of a man who had once set the continent on fire. The group saluted as the fire burned. No words were spoken. The atmosphere was heavy with smoke, fear, and disbelief. Ash and bone would soon be all that remained. By nightfall, what little was left was hastily buried in the garden. The ground would later be dug up by Soviet forces and examined obsessively. But nothing substantial remained. Hitler's final act had succeeded, not in escaping judgment, but in erasing the physical evidence of his downfall. Thus ended the corporeal existence of Adolf Hitler in flames and shadows. A dictator who had unleashed unprecedented destruction across Europe, reduced to a pile of scorched fragments. The fire he once wielded returned to claim him. His body vanished, but the scars he left on history could not be burned away. As the smoke of cremation still lingered above the Chancellery Garden, the atmosphere inside the Führerbunker devolved into utter chaos. The death of Adolf Hitler marked not only the end of his life, but the disintegration of the last remaining thread of order within the collapsing Nazi regime. Fear gripped the bunker's inhabitants. Some sought escape, others prepared to die. Those left behind knew their time was limited. The Soviet forces were closing in rapidly. Within hours, they would seize the government quarter. Every hallway in the bunker echoed with hurried footsteps, whispered plans, and quiet sobs. The once meticulously controlled command post had become a scene of despair. Joseph Goebbels, now chancellor by Hitler's decree, made no attempt to escape. Instead, he and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children in the bunker before taking their own lives. Their bodies, like Hitler's, were burned in the garden above. Others, however, clung to hope. A small group led by SS officer Wilhelm Mohnke attempted to break through Soviet lines in a desperate bid for freedom. Some succeeded in reaching the western sectors to surrender to American or British troops. Others were captured by Soviet soldiers, interrogated, and in many cases, never seen again. The bunker became a crime scene. Soviet investigators descended into the ruins, determined to confirm Hitler's death. They found partial remains, dental records and testimonies, fragments of a myth unraveling. The Soviets kept much of what they discovered secret. The uncertainty surrounding Hitler's fate fed conspiracy theories that would persist for decades. But for those who were there, the reality was grim and immediate. The Third Reich was dead, buried in rubble and silence. The bunker, once a symbol of Hitler's unyielding control, now echoed with the final collapse of his world. Its walls bore witness to the fall of an empire, not with defiance, but with whispers, smoke, and surrender. Adolf Hitler's death was not the dramatic final stand of a hero, but the muted, humiliating end of a man who had plunged the world into chaos. His final moments, spent in a dim, concrete bunker beneath the ruins of his capital, were a far cry from the grandeur and triumph he had envisioned for himself. It was the ultimate irony, the self-styled messiah of the German Reich, reduced to a trembling figure, ending his life in a subterranean tomb, soaked in paranoia and failure. The symbolism of his death is inescapable. Unlike the battlefield death of a soldier or the martyrdom he once threatened to embrace, Hitler died by his own hand, hidden from the world. There were no crowds, no flags, no eulogies. Only a pistol, a cyanide capsule, and the quiet stillness that followed. The man who demanded absolute loyalty, who orchestrated mass murder and built a cult around his image, died as a shrinking, broken man. His body was burned not out of honor, but out of fear. Fear that it might be captured, defiled, and displayed. The final fire erased his physical presence, but it could not erase the legacy of destruction he left behind. Cities in ruins, millions dead, a continent scarred. The bunker became his grave, not only in the literal sense, but in a symbolic one. It was the burial chamber of his delusions, ambitions, and the fascist nightmare he had unleashed. Hitler's death did not end the pain he caused, but it did mark the conclusion of his grip on the world. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was haunted. History would not remember him with reverence. His end was not one of redemption or glory. It was a collapse, physical and moral, fitting only for a tyrant. His image, once engineered to project strength, was shattered. What remained was the truth, not a savior, but a destroyer, not a visionary, but a coward. In death, Hitler became what he had always tried to deny: fragile, mortal, and ultimately insignificant in the face of time and truth. The nightmare ended not with an explosion, but with a whimper in the dark. And for those who survived his reign, that silence was the beginning of healing.